the majority of our life is lived in liminal space.
And there's this in-between space, this liminal space.
This liminality that reveals possibility.
I think we're in a liminal moment, but also in a place of transformation.
I have great affection for the church and a troubled relationship with it.
Just to be alive in time means that we're on the threshold of the future.
That can't be the gospel, because God said to love our neighbors.
We don't know what the future looks like. We have to work it out together.
All right, Andrew Davis, welcome back to the Liminal Living Podcast. Your third appearance here for us.
It is great to be back, Tom. Thank you. Yeah. 3 already, so hopefully not the last.
I'm definitely not planning on this being the last one. So I was just talking with you before we hit record, where I've kind of talked to a lot of the people that I thought I needed to establish, credibility and whatnots, you being one of those people. But then I was like, okay, now who do I want to talk to? Because I'm at the point now, it's like, I talked to a lot of famous people and that's pretty cool. That was neat. But now I get to talk to the people that I really, really want to talk to about specific questions about the world. And so you kind of inhabit both those worlds because you wrote some books. I was like, dude, if I could get this guy on the show, that'd be awesome. And then I did. And then we did it again. And I was like, all right. So you're kind of in both those worlds. As someone that I was like, it'd be really cool if he came on. But now it's also someone's like, I got questions about the world and I really want to talk to Andrew again. So there we are.
I'm happy to be back. Yeah, no, I've enjoyed, just as a prefatory comment, a lot of the conversations you've had. So, you make me famous and then we get to have conversations. That's how this works now.
I make you famous. You make me famous. Let's just be famous
together.
It's all reciprocal.
It's
all reciprocal. Well, let's see. What I really enjoy about your works is they're hard to read. It's because you think so precisely academically, and it's not like I'm just diving into some pop psychology book or something. It's you write in such a way. You're academically disciplined. You got, you have your doctorate, PhD. You're a metaphysicist, a philosopher. You got all this heady, really disciplined academic way of approaching the world. And yet somehow, I can tell by the way that you think and what you write about that the world around you is still soaked with wonder and awe. And it's really hard to find both of those things at the same time. So I'm wondering when did that wonder awaken in you and how have you kept it alive? Is there an early memory of you just being in awe of the universe or something?
Well, thank you for that. And first to say, the whole idea that, philosophy has to be barren from enchantment or wonder is just sort of silliness. I think I'll come back to that theme of wonder. We'll sort of circulate back to it. But yeah, I mean, when I think of my own work as a philosopher, I can't really think early on of any one moment, say, that sticks out. I think it's more a general sense of just the shock of being, right? Yeah. Think of John Mack used the language of ontological shock, and I like that. He used it more about, the aftermath of the shock of UFO and abductee experiences. I don't use it in that sense, haven't had those experiences. But I think sort of the language of ontological shock can be generalized and applied to this moment that a lot of people have, or maybe a series of moments when you realize your own contingency. It's like the shock of being at all when you might not have otherwise been. Mm-hmm. And so I think I've had that experience throughout my life, even as a young kid. And I've always inhabited what I think is generally an enchanted cosmos. The curiosity of it was that, I was a part of this. I was in relation to this wider cosmic environment. And so I remember just as a kid kind of poking at the universe with questions, with wonder, with thoughts. And then at different points throughout my life, I'd have this sense the universe pokes back, right? And again, this sort of relationality you have, a finite being with this sort of infinite kind of environment. But of course, looking back to my early context was the evangelical cosmos. I think we've talked about this before. But even in that cosmos, at least as it was given to me through my schooling, there was still room for wonder. There was still room for rebellion. I think of my early Bible classes being positive experiences for the most part, mainly because my teacher would let debates be live. We'd let questions stand. We wouldn't close them down and class would end. And I felt like, okay, well, this is an unsettled issue, this universe and all that's happening. And I have something to add to it. And so then on the weekends, I remember friends, we'd go up to Rocky Point, sort of this hilltop neighborhood, beautiful view, stars, and just again, poke at the universe again. and look at the stars and wonder about life elsewhere and what all is going on. So, looking back, these are sort of early indications of a philosopher waking up within me, and it was all about wonder. I mean, even the early Greeks almost defined philosophy in terms of wonder. And, Whitehead, my favorite philosopher, says, philosophy begins in wonder, and in the end, when philosophic thought has done its best, the wonder remains. And I love that. Philosophy is about cultivating the remaining wonder. It's not about ridding yourself of wonder. It's more about its proper sort of cultivation, about its preservation, not extirpation, right? So I just fell in love with wonder, and I found out later that you could be a philosopher and do that. And I don't think the universe has ever been really disenchanted. It's evolved for me, but it's never been fully disenchanted. But that's not the case for everybody, right? And in some sense, the modern worldview helped facilitate a certain, disenchantment that a lot of people are still trying to weed themselves out of in some way.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, a lot of people who make their way out of kind of a smaller metaphysic of how the universe works that evangelical fundamentalism constructed for them, they kind of work their way out, and then they naturally have this disenchanted world around them because all of their enchanted definitions of what prayer was and how it worked and who God was and how God worked all seems to have fallen apart. And they're kind of left with this flattened materialistic world where they don't trust any of the enchantment that they experience anymore. Because they'll say, well, should I pray about that? Like, I don't even know if I should pray. Like, does it even work? What does it do? Like, because their understanding has fallen apart and they've deconstructed it, and then trying to reconstruct their world and putting enchantment back in is really difficult to do because you don't trust your experience of enchanted things anymore because you had to reject that. So do you think there's a way to kind of reintroduce enchantment into people's worlds who have deconstructed it and kind of left it flat and now they don't trust any experience of enchantment? How would you go about answering that?
No, it's such a good question. And I found, because I too deconstructed from a more fundamentalist or evangelical worldview. And then the sort of default worldview I then adopted, I wouldn't say fully rejected it. I sort of recognized the value of my upbringing, but it also seemed quite apparent that upbringing did not have a full grasp on the detail, the mystery, the nature of things in a way that kept me inspired. I felt sort of left dry. But I realized that I sort of then adopted a sort of default mechanistic, materialistic worldview, and then I had to find my way out of that eventually. And I did it through reading. I did it through almost a kind of monistic lifestyle of pursuing truth through various degree programs, through the cultivation of a sense of art, of recognizing beauty, right? There's whole domains of spiritual practice that assist us with rekindling enchantment. But I just find it interesting that I went from, more of this evangelical persuasion, never fully leaving it, but then just assumed the world was sort of barren matter and mechanism because I thought that's what science told me was the way things were. Studying philosophy and spirituality, a number of disciplines showed me that was certainly not the way the world was. And even, modern science would at its root tell us that that's not the way the world is. It's just that this kind of worldview emerged and it's still lingering in the culture, even if the results of modern science itself are counter to it, So I think all those things come into play, but there's nothing in the scientific worldview that requires you to have a disenchanted world. And I didn't know that. And so coming up, I had to rethink science. I had to rethink what its limits, what it could say, what it could not say, and rethink a metaphysics, which is the total synthetic worldview in which all of the data of human experience has to fit: science, religion, art, aesthetics, etc. There has to be a whole holistic worldview metaphysically that makes sense of the various forms of data. And so it was a slow process of reading, of thinking, of writing, of developing a vision in which meaning and enchantment are fundamental, a fundamental part of it. So yeah, I mean, it's a long process, right? But I think the encouragement would be for people to hang in there, right? Don't point to science as being the means of your disenchantment when you haven't really looked at what that science says, nor have you really developed a metaphysics that would be consistent with it, right? So, I mean, those are just a few things.
Yeah, I like how that definition of metaphysic where, all human experience has to fit inside of it. And I think when it comes to like enchantment, we don't have a spot for that. Like that's more of like a tag along, almost like something that doesn't fit in the metaphysic at all, because that's supposed to be scientific, materialistic. And so we kind of wink and nod at it. We created an entirely separate world for it called the supernatural world, but mostly the natural world is right here. And then, you know, we have to separate those two out. And then we have like two metaphysics at that point. There's the one of my faith and then the one of my lived experience. And I'm trying to build a bridge between those two, because if your faith doesn't actually work in your lived human experience, then it's not real at all, because we have, I mean, God created the world, the whole thing. And so it has to somehow function here and not just create a separate basket for it that we just take off the shelf when we need it, when we're in times of question or trouble or hardship or whatever. And then we just put it back on the shelf, and then the rest of our life is lived with a separate metaphysic altogether. I like what you said about poking the universe with a stick, and then the universe pokes back. Like there's a relationality to that metaphysic that I've not ever thought about it that way. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you put it that way, a lot of folks can sit back and think, well, yeah, what are the times I've been sort of cosmologically poked, as it were, you know? Like, because there's rhythms and rivers of insight that are a deep part of this universe, right? And that cannot be simply explained away. You know, things are eminently deep and not shallow, and that could have been otherwise, but it's not, right? So I just think your comments are beautiful there about not bifurcating human experience, either in the context of faith or in the context of science, because as long as we are part and parcel of nature, which we are, then we're a clue as to the nature and character of this universe, of what it's up to. So one of the big problems with modern disenchantment was that scientific worldview that emerged slowly but surely, and that bracketed human experience, right? The methodology was brilliant. Look at all the success we've seen in science. But when a methodology becomes a metaphysics, then we're overstepping, right?
Oh, that's good.
We trust in the abstractions of our methods, but we forget what was abstracted, right? Again, our experience as being sort of part and parcel of nature. So, you know, it's no, in one way, when we bracket experience, it's like, it's no wonder that you end up with a materialistic, sort of mechanistic universe. And then if you apply that theologically, right, at least in the history of science, it's like, okay, the God of theism becomes the God of deism, right? Because if the universe is a mechanism, well, God's not a part of the world machine. But deism is a short step away from atheism, right? And then the proclamation of sort of God's death based upon science is sort of the reigning claim of scientific naturalism. Of course, it's all sort of premature, but there's nothing, again, in science that requires that nowadays. And the best scientists would tell you that, you know. I just think when you think about some of the best scientists, whether it's, you know, Eddington or James Jeans or Planck or Schrodinger or Whitehead even, right? All of them are interested in integrating the depths of human experience with what the sciences reveal. Ultimately, those have to be reconciled some way, because again, we're not separate from what the sciences study. So all of them appeal to, you know, science and spirit, or metaphysics and mysticism, as having a sort of collaborative mutuality that I think we're continuing to explore as science continues on in various ways. So I just think that it's important to emphasize that point you brought up of not bracketing experience either from faith or from science. It all is one world. And again, metaphysics is the synthetic context in which all that data has to find coherence in some way. But it's not a dogmatic thing. It's a tentative, adventurous process. At least that's how Whitehead framed the metaphysical endeavor. And enchantment is part and parcel of all of it.
Yeah, I like that. Like many people kind of assume that like a sacred worldview or a magical worldview like requires belief in some kind of separate world than the one that we live in, and we have to create those two worlds. And if you look at where science is progressing, it's getting more spooky. You know, it's like we cannot understand how quantum physics is. It sounds more spiritual when you dive into it then. So I'm wondering, as we progress scientifically and we learn more things about human psychology and biology, neurology, as we learn more things about the cosmos and how physics works and quantum physics, as we learn more things up, like it seems like the modern religious movement is a reaction against that to try and go backwards into the more medieval metaphysic of like a Thomas Aquinas, where that was a lord in a tower kind of a feudal system, and that's how they contextualize God. And we just haven't had a recontextualization in quite some time. And so we're just always reactionary. Since the 1890s, the 1920s, the 1930s, we're reacting against new information that comes out instead of trying to integrate this new understanding into our worldview. How do we remain open when so much scientific discovery is advancing so fast? We can't keep up with it. It seems to be outpacing our religious doctrines, dogmas, and understandings. How can religious people still remain open and try to keep pace with the rapid evolving of the human race at this point?
I mean, it's such a good question. And right, I mean, one of the criticisms of religion is that it doesn't keep up with those fast pace, advancements of science. And this might be partly because it deals with a different set of phenomena, right? In some way, things of ultimate concern, things of ultimate meaning. And even Whitehead says, religion has been slow to upkeep with scientific advance. People like, Stephen Hawking also say this about philosophers, right? Philosophy's dead. It hasn't kept up with physics. Of course, he didn't read much philosophy, as great a scientist as he was. So I just think, this distinction you've made between a reactionary and an integrative is really, really important. What is required, from all parties is a healthy dose of cosmological humility here, right? There's something that the religions are pointing to that is right? That is shrouded in mystery, but has roots in some sense. There's something that the sciences are pointing to that is right? That is about exterior kind of reality, whereas we might say religion and spirituality is about more interior modes of being and becoming. The exterior, it's like the flip sides of coins. You have to have them together. But let me just say something about the reactionary theme too, because you mentioned that as science advances at every age, there's reactionaries which, maybe try to pull us back to certain affirmations behind us as opposed to ahead of us, right? The integrative may be ahead of us, the reactionary behind us. But even if you think about like the whole development of a mechanistic, materialistic worldview was in the context of theological reaction, right? So Newton, Descartes, Galileo, these are some of the pioneer thinkers of modern science, supernaturalists themselves in a real way, right? So again, if you hold that the world is a machine and God also exists, God's not a part of the machine, God's outside it in some way. And should God want to intervene, then conceiving that intervention is one of interruption, right? And I often say, as many people bring up, Newton's notion that God would, if he wanted to, from time to time, have to come in and adjust the rotations of the planets. But the larger point here is that the theological backdrop of a mechanistic, materialistic worldview, its rise, that worldview's rise, was a reaction to a more hermetic and magical worldview. Okay, this is a worldview where that was animistic, that was alive, where spirits and entities and action at a distance was taking place. And so there was a whole argument. David Griffin has demonstrated this beautifully. Whole argument between theologians and more hermetic sort of traditions, and the rise of modern mechanistic science being a sort of reaction to the dangers of a more magical realist, if you want, worldview, which seemed to challenge God's omnipotence or challenge God's supernatural kind of nature. And so the more magical nature of nature was bracketed for sort of theological apologetic reasons, and this helped facilitate a mechanistic, materialistic worldview on theological grounds. And so there's sort of a reaction to different shifting sort of worldviews. But of course, just as a final comment, I think when we come to today, we're seeing much more integrative themes happening. I mean, of course, there's also reactions, but just as an example, data like parapsychology, telepathy, or healings, or data that was once seen to be either supernatural or miraculous, are now being studied, academic and in scientific avenues. And again, you have some Christians, some theologians who are reacting against this, right? The world doesn't work that way, or it's demonic, because we're trying to preserve a certain image of the reality of God. And others who are saying, hey, the universe is much more mysterious than we thought. God's universe, as it were, is much more wild than we thought. And we have to integrate the best of this data with our worldview. So, I mean, we could take it anywhere from there, but those are a few ways in which it's like what we do is we have to pay attention to the data. We have to pay attention to, history, but we have to keep our imaginations and possibilities of integration alive because we don't want to just have a God of the gaps, right? Where, there's a gap, let's put God in it. And then science fills that gap and God retreats further and further. Arguably, this was this move from theism to deism to atheism to now there is no need for God. But of course, where the world's not a machine, as we know, if it's more an organism, right? Then this opens up all different sort of avenues for reaffirming the reality of a symbiotic type of immanent understanding of the relation of God. But we'll come to that when you're.
Yeah. And I was actually going to bring up the God of the Gaps thing because I just saw Neil deGrasse Tyson talk about even Newton used the God of the Gaps to explain. He's like, all of my mathematical formulations for the rotation of Jupiter works, but somehow it doesn't pull Earth out of its orbit and fling it into the cosmos. So God must step in every now and then and correct it and then step back out. And then science explains something else. And then then God retreats. And then, I think that there is we haven't had to have an ontological humility as the church because we've held so much authority. Then science covers that ground and explains something away from the magical world that we've been telling people. I think it maybe even started in the Reformation when he's like, well, no, it actually doesn't become the actual body of Christ. It doesn't do that magically, but, spiritually, symbolically, we're starting to then explain things. And so there's this retreat of how much ground our faith can then claim authority over and explain things as science takes over more of that ground of explanation. And it feels like a football game, where there's we're retreating back, So how do we, how do we play together instead of think of these things as two competing worldviews, where science is taking over the ground that we once had and we want to take it back. And instead of this fighting, how can we synthesize these two things together to be just a way of thinking and being in the world that's a little more humble than the materialist scientist or the dogmatic religious person?
Yeah, totally. No, it's such an important and great question. And you mentioned there, deGrasse Tyson. I think he's, obviously very popular and influential. I like his general personality, but this is not someone I'd take philosophical cues from, right?
No,
and
not at all.
Maybe not even some scientific cues. So I don't know, maybe I'm being too harsh on him, but I just have not been impressed with his dialogue with philosophers. And sort of like Hawking, it's a quick dismissal of philosophy or theology. It makes sense too if you're thinking that most theologians think what Newton thought. But theology too progresses. The scientists often overlook that. It's like science can progress, but when we treat theology, we have to treat, what we assume, what was a few hundred years old. It's like that's a little bit disingenuous. But I mean, your question is so important. How do we relate science and spirituality, science and religion? And there's all sorts of wrong questions that get asked, that's for sure. But I think one of the general themes would be each side has to avoid overstatement, because overstatement basically procures misrepresentation of the other side. And we see this in science all the time. Scientists just simply assume that its data based on matter and mechanism is, the final story of the universe. But of course, luckily, quantum revolution blew this apart, right? And really, there's no informed scientists today that would hold to an old-fashioned materialism. If they do, they're really out of step with things. But again, materialism of this old form is still in the culture, and this poses, at least people think it poses, it does, if it's true, a challenge to spirituality. So science, don't overstate your case, right? Because you misrepresent other avenues of data and other avenues of meaning that really need to be included, right? After all, the whole edifice of science is presupposing the worth, the value of truth, of pursuing truth for its own sake. But then if we look at the side of religion, or spirituality, they may overstate the case by assuming that science simply doesn't add anything to their worldview or can simply sort of be ignored. But again, I think after the quantum revolution, metaphysics, if you want, after quantum physics, throws everything into a kind of melting pot. This is how Whitehead put it. So that science and spirituality, again, can be seen as mutual allies. And I mentioned a few of those thinkers earlier, right? Schrodinger, Einstein, Planck, Eddington, all of them were interested in the spiritual dimension. And they didn't see it as inherently contradictory to their science. So why then do we have scientists today, who are nowhere near the caliber of these pioneer founders, just asserting that there's a great divide between science and the spirit, or metaphysics and mysticism? It just sort of bugs me.
Yeah.
But I think the overall theme here that I'm highlighting is overstatement procures misrepresentation, and no discipline's sort of immune to that. We need the best of science. We need the best of spirituality. We need them working together as the interior and exterior domains of human life. And I just think of one of my favorite quotes from Whitehead. He says, "You cannot shelter theology from science or science from theology, nor can you shelter any of them from metaphysics or metaphysics from any of them." And then he follows it up saying, "There is no shortcut to truth."
Wow.
And so, that last line is really brilliant, because to the extent that science and spirituality are striving for shortcuts to truth, then they're going to fail. The larger point is truth is collaborative, right? And we need the best of human disciplines and human data to inform that truth. Otherwise, we're working with half-truths rather than whole truths. And Whitehead said, half-truths play the devil with whole truths.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I've kind of been following very loosely the Department of Perceptual Studies out of the University of Virginia, where they do very, very much like deep dive academic research into things like near-death experiences, people coming back from the dead, or people having memories of previous lives when they're children. They're collecting databases of people's experiences and stories, and then trying to back those up. They're academically studying these things. And it's kind of spooky when you get into it, but it's also like, this is a part of the human experience. Consciousness is weird. We don't even know what it is, where it comes from, how we experience it. And I'm wondering if maybe we're seeing something in that realm, like something like the theology of spirit coming out, but attaching some science to it, attaching some neurology to it, attaching some, psychology to it. How would you go about defining spirit if we're not talking about some otherworldly, supernatural, outside of this world thing that every once in a while just kind of peeks beyond the curtain and says hello, but is actually integrated part of the physical world? How would you describe spirit?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Before I go there, let me just comment on, you mentioned Virginia, perceptual studies, or the history at Harvard of psychical research, right? And there's thousands of extremely well-meaning, well-educated people who are, as you rightly say, studying extraordinary forms of experience at an academic and scientific level. And it lends itself to that study as well. Right? That's interesting. So I just think we have to be open to the data of parapsychology, of near-death experience. I have friends and colleagues working in that world, and it's a part of the demands of science that you be open to a broad witness of data, provided it's trustworthy, right? And so a lot of the times people will bracket things they don't like because their worldview is too small. Their scientific worldview is too small, right? If you're to allow for action at a distance via telepathy or near-death experience, and suggest that some of these are real, right? That's very uncomfortable for some people. So I just think we have to be humble. We have to be open to the data. And above all, we have to be willing to let our worldview expand beyond what we want to be possible, right? So there's an element of wishful thinking that can be critiqued on many sides here. We have to stay faithful to the data, but we have to keep imagination alive too. Now, your question was about, right, how do we think about spirit, right? Can we think of it as not some extra add-on, which might have been the case in previous worlds, as it were. And I think absolutely we can. We might think of spirit as synonymous with that inner dimension of life, that animated dimension of life, or even mind or psyche. So it's interesting today that after the death of materialism, where matter is seen to be this inert, valueless, vacuous stuff, we see a lot of different proposals returning. Idealism, right, where mind is fundamental, or spirit is fundamental. These are often used interchangeably. Or even panpsychism, right, which wants to say that experience or mind or sentience in some sense belongs to nature as an ontological primitive. All that means is it goes all the way down. There's no one state of nature that is fully mindless, fully without spirit, fully devoid of even soul, right? So mind, spirit, soul, these are, there's differences we might parse out, but for me, in this discussion, I think they're generally synonymous, And again, it's not as if a panpsychist worldview is against science, right? So a few decades ago, panpsychism was thought to be anathema, right? Sort of ridiculous. Nowadays, I'm happy to say, and process thinkers anticipated this, the sort of renaissance of panpsychism is more of a mainstream position at the status of mind or spirit or soul in nature. So nature is animated. It's not just dead. Relations are not just external, they're internal. Evolution really is internal growth toward external influence, and none of that could happen really on a materialistic worldview. So I think spirit is back in matter these days, and it goes by different names: panpsychism, pan-experientialism, forms of idealism. It's really an exciting time. And again, when you relocate spirit and matter, then suddenly science and spirit are part and parcel of each other, right? In some way, we have to work out what that looks like depending on different data or certain, stories we tell ourselves about experience and science. But I think they're wedded together again, and the literature, philosophically, theologically, is showing that, I think, and it's an exciting time to be writing, frankly.
Yeah, and it almost feels like we did go back, but before that distinct separation of material and supernatural world, because the word for spirit in the Greek is the same word for breath, because that was the animating force. You took it in from outside of yourself, and then it came in, and then you exhaled it. And so it was like this spirit was a physical thing that was a part of your body, just like your breath is. So it does feel like we did go and separate those things out, and now we're trying to bring them back together, but not in an ancient way, but in something that is a progressive way.
Yeah, it's not an ancient way, but, the ancient world did see the universe as animated, right? Matter was not just inert, but more participatory in nature. Now, we developed in the modern world the whole idea of a dead, vacuous piece of matter, which Whitehead critiques as a total abstraction. It's an abstraction. It's a picture taken of a movie-like experience, and but there's other reasons why mind re-enters or spirit re-enters matter, and one of them has been in the philosophical discourse in the philosophy of mind, the whole problem of accounting for mind-matter relationship, or the hard problem of consciousness. As David Chalmers put it. The whole hard problem is how on earth you get mind or spirit, say, out of vacuous dead matter if it's not already a part of that substance, that material, that process already. And the mainstream opinion now, I think, at least in my circles, is that the hard problem remains hard. We've not at all, or in the least, solved the issue that if the universe is mindless, that mind emerges in it, right? And even William James said this is an unbridgeable kind of gap, So I just think relocating mind or spirit and matter is not just a theoretical thing, even though it's a part of that. We see it in science. We see it in theoretical biology with Michael Levin, one of my favorite recent scientists at Tufts University. And he's demonstrating at length the reality of embodied cognition, of mentality, of purpose, going all the way down in nature. So he is a panpsychist, and he's a panpsychist because of his science, not because of his philosophy, right? So he's staying very close to the data. So I just want to emphasize that the theoretical and the scientific are both pointing toward the relocation of some sort of interior mentality, spirit, experience as belonging to nature fundamentally, and not just some arbitrary add-on.
Yeah. As you're talking, I was thinking of other ancient spiritualities that tie kind of the spirit and the material world together. The Celtics believed that stone had memory. Now, it wouldn't be a conscious mind that has thoughts and is consciously thinking of things, but they said that had memory. And then the Christians come and say you got to get rid of all of that paganistic way of thinking and believing, and just believe what we're telling you. And then we fast forward a little bit, then we have like witchcraft, was very much demonized. It was more of like a way of the feminine holding on to a sense of power in a very patriarchal world. Because when you can't influence things, then in the real world, then you're going to attach yourself to some kind of magic. It's a way of saying, I can influence my world. And then the religious response was, well, we got to shut that down. Same with Native Americans. Native Americans had a very connected, integrated, this is how the world works, and spirit and matter and all this stuff. And then we come in and say, no, actually, you can't. So it seems like this colonial perspective, Western academic colonial tied to Christianity, comes in and replaces all of the enchanted worlds of peoples and says, well, here's a bunch of doctrines and dogmas you need to now believe in. And then it's like we've robbed the world of the enchantment that we now seek to find. Am I close on anything there?
No, I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying there, and it's certainly the case that, more indigenous worldviews, animistic worldviews had that deep visceral connection that was severed in the development of modern science. And that was reinforced, unfortunately, in a lot of forms of dogmatic Christianity, right? Where human beings are fundamentally different in kind, really, from the rest of the world, right? But we're the imago Dei, right? And everything else isn't. Now, that doesn't necessarily, at least doctrinally, give you license to dominate things. It just so happens that has been a part of the situation, right? So, I just think that we have to reawaken our attention to the past, to these indigenous worldviews. There's still enchantment in Christian faith, and we shouldn't give too many grounds to fundamentalist or evangelical Christianity, because this is not the dominant form historically of Christian expression. It's a contingent modern form, right? And that's been demonstrated in many ways, different literature on that. So I just think that the world can be animated for the Christian conception too. There's nothing theologically that requires us to see nature as inert. There's much that requires actually that it not be seen that way. So, but this is a part of, I think, openness to dialogue, to collaboration, to critique. And if we need to leave certain, dimensions of our world behind for a while, that's okay. It's like God saying to Abraham, go to this place that I will show you. It's like, well, okay, where is it? Well, just go and we'll show you.
Start walking.
I'm gonna walk with you as we find our way into a new context together. And so, in the whole rigid formulaic repetition of dogma, this is not the essence of Christianity. In the first place, language is totally inadequate to express what we experience. Whitehead called the fallacy the perfect dictionary. This whole idea that, all the words we've developed that are recited either in science or in the creeds of religion are adequate to express the realities they think they're expressing. They're not, right? Words are metaphors mutely appealing for an imaginative leap, he says, right? Metaphor is the way to get past the failure of language into the necessity of imagination, right? Which is where the real discoveries happen. That's the way it is in science. Arguably, I'd say that's the way it is in doctrinal developments too. Imagination's been a part of all this. So we have to, keep that imagination alive and keep that dialogue open.
Yeah. And some of the most intelligent people I know are the ones who are artists and poets, and they see the world for what it is. And instead of try to wrap academic definitions around things, they paint a picture. They'll compose a poem about it. And then that speaks to you. It almost bypasses the reasoning and gets right at the heart of you, where you can't reject. It's like, well, this statement is incorrect because, the world is not necessarily charged with the grandeur of God. Like you're not dissecting each word as you would if you were trying to define doctrinally, dogmatically, or scientifically, what is this and how does it work? Like, it's almost like art, poetry, and all those things. They bypass the reasoning that will disenchant it before it gets to you. And then it just arrives enchanted and it does something there. Do you think there's room in the sciences and religion to reintroduce these artistic enchantments to maybe wake us up?
Totally.
How do we do this?
Yeah. Yeah, that's harder. But no, I absolutely think there's room for it. I think the whole idea that science is immune from story, from symbol, from poetry, from myth is just, silly. Without those things, we couldn't actually tell the story of science, right? And obviously they belong more obviously in sort of the religious tradition, we think of scripture and poetry and the various sort of literary forms there. But it is so essential. Chapter 5 of Whitehead's Science in the Modern World is titled The Romantic Reaction. And it's his praise, essentially, of the Romantic poets who protested, he says, dead nature as dissected by science. And their protest, he says, was a protest on behalf of value, or the exclusion of value from the essence of matter of fact. So just as you're saying, a certain scientific rationalism looks to the outside, to the pieces, to the fragments, wanting to know how things work at a quantitative sort of level. And what it brackets is that qualitative sense of the value of what we're studying, of our communication, of our betweenness, as it were, our liminality with nature in a deep and abiding sense. So I think poetry, the various arts, these are ways of awakening a deeper felt sense of value. And it's necessary. It's necessary because science at its best is a devotion to the value of truth. And I think if we forget that, it becomes sort of bare. So value undergirds science itself. And I think the purposes of the arts, in many ways, the humanities, right, is to keep that story of value told and to provide the means for the felt sense of worth that is attached to every element of the human endeavor. So how do we do it? I think it's a personal, spiritual thing for people. But I think we need to adopt modes of creativity, whether that's through art, whether that's through singing, music. I particularly think music's one of the most powerful ways of the felt sense of value. Different genres offering you different levels of sort of perceiving the values in reality. So it's just, it's odd though, because scientists, often, and I love science, I'm all for science, but don't bracket all your human experience in the laboratory. It's like methodologically, as we were saying earlier, this makes sense. It makes sense at a certain level, but you have to reintegrate somehow, So like the element of purpose, for example, Whitehead has this great paragraph in his book, The Function of Reason, where he's talking about purpose in nature, essentially. And he pokes fun at scientists who, design these elaborate experiments to show that, animal bodies are not motivated by purposes. They, publish papers in, nice academic journals saying that, purpose is not a part of, the animal world. And then he ends it saying, scientists animated by the purpose of proving they are purposeless constitute an interesting subject of study. It's such a great line. And again, Whitehead being a great philosopher, a great scientist himself, and a great lover of the poets. So we can't just fuel the STEM fields. We need that. But without the humanities, well, our humanity is lost. And we have to have a way of integrating both those things. And science at its best does that. But again, we need to continually remind ourselves of that, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a hesitation to adopt something that we can't explain or understand. And I do a lot of funerals. I'm really good at them. I do like 30 a year kind of a thing. So I do a lot of them.
Wow.
A lot of people I don't know. A lot of people ask for, they weren't very religious, so we don't need to do this, whole dogmatic approach to things. And I tell the story of when I lost my dad, and it was 10 years ago. At the funeral, someone told me, like, your dad will come and visit you, every time you see a dragonfly, then that's your dad come to say hi. And my brain was like, well, that's a bunch of bullshit. I was like, whatever. But I was like, thank you. That's nice of you. And for me, I was like, that's not how it works. I know that. Like, that's stupid. And I had like this arrogance to me that wouldn't adopt anything like that. And then that summer I was on the river where we hang out in the sand barefoot, and this dragonfly landed on my toe. It just stared at me for like 30 minutes, and I was just crying. And
nice.
It was like this humility hit me in that moment. It's like, crap, I was wrong. But I also don't know how this works. So then I was hesitant to accept the experience as being valid because I couldn't explain how it works. It's like my dad possessing the dragonfly, and he's looking at me and trying to say hello. And it's like, well, no, that's probably not how it works. And I couldn't accept that for a long time. So I tell people this at the funerals. I'm like, look, I don't know how it works. I just know that it is true. And so you're going to experience these as well. Don't think you're crazy. Our loved ones do somehow. From the beyond, let us know they're okay. Send messages along. Maybe it's a dragonfly. Maybe it's a redbird. Maybe it's a deer. Maybe that song comes on the radio and it totally catches you off guard. And I don't know how it works. I just know that it's true. And I've had to just accept that humility in order to let an enchanted world come in and revive me. And so many people connect with that story. I have to say it at every single funeral, or the funeral directors will be upset. I think there is something in that prideful, like, no, I don't know how it works, so I can't accept it kind of a thing. So do you see that at play in any way, shape, or form?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, just first, I think that's a beautiful story. Yeah. No wonder you need to bring it back, because it preaches.
It preaches.
And I lost my mom just under 10 years ago as well. It's probably, similar, same time as your father, from breast cancer. She was 63, and the whole notion of death being some final cold collapse to what was living, it's hard to reckon with, but it depends again on your worldview as to what happens next, right? It seems to me that there's only two logical things. One would be that the adventure continues, and in that case, I'm very excited to see what that would be. The other is that you're not there, and therefore not, there's nothing to miss out on, right? Now, I think there's all sorts of good reasons to think that the adventure does continue, and that your dad and my mom, beyond what we can conceive, are continuing that adventure now in some way. And maybe they're related to us at levels or frequencies that we simply can't know. There's nothing anti-science about that. Science doesn't tell you anything about a post-mortem state. Well, if you take near-death experience seriously, which I think you should, there might be a lot of reasons to take this more seriously. So, but the general question about whether or not you need to know how something works before you can appreciate or believe of an experience, right? This is really important too. And again, it tends to be a part of a certain strict rationalism, right? That we have to know the bits and pieces and how they work mechanically. And then once we do, that's exhausted the explanation, which is not true. It's like, there's so many examples you could give. It's like, I don't need, or this way, I may know everything I need to know about the rotation of the earth or the light hitting the retinas of my eyes during a sunset. I can explain it mechanically, but that doesn't offer a total explanation. It's not a cumulative explanation for the absolute qualitative joy that it is to watch a sunset. So it's like we have to see things at different levels. Explaining things is at one level, meaning and value at another, but these are not contrary to each other. And all you have to do is look at the history of science. It's like, what gives more meaning than a good scientist than to explain something that once was mysterious but now is understood? A value is achieved in terms of understanding, and that provides their lives with meaning, whether in biology or psychology or cosmology. So I understand the need to want to pursue explanation. We can't lose that. But a kind of quantitative explanation is not an explanation of the quality of the experience. And again, those are sort of flip sides to each other that we have to hold in a sort of wavering balance.
Yeah.
Does that connect at all?
Yeah. It actually brought up a second question as you're thinking about that is, I think what a flattened materialist world does with the sciences to explain away things, I think Christians can be tempted to use theology in the same way, where that is designated in a different world for a different purpose in a whole supernatural realm. So we don't really talk about it. We don't really think about it. They're off in heaven now. There's nothing you can do about it. There's no communication back and forth. And so it's almost like our doctrines can even write away the human experience in the same way that science could write away the human experience of something. If it doesn't fit into the framework of how I understand the world to be, then I have to then do something with it. And theology does, I think, the same thing that science does in many cases. When we don't know how to explain it, we just designate it as a different area, different world, we can't work with that kind of a thing. Does that make sense? It's in my head. I don't know if I'm saying it properly.
No. I just think you're speaking to, I think, the limits of our worldview and what we're comfortable with, and I just think cosmological humility is the name of the game, whether in science or in religion. You can have your religious convictions, have your scientific convictions, but we face profound and abiding mysteries, right? And if we have experiences that challenge the shackles of our worldview, we have to be willing to expand them a bit. There's just, again, a lot of examples. The evolution debate with respect to theology, or, mystical experience with respect to science. It's like part of the problem of humanity is our siloed disciplines, especially in education. But the fact that these different arenas of insight and data don't talk to each other, or if they do so at levels that are antagonistic. So this is, again, one of the roles of metaphysics is the harmony of our disciplines in some sense, is to speak to how they fit together, but never without cosmological humility. And again, I quote Whitehead, who says, the merest hint of dogmatism as to finality of statement is an exhibition of folly, right? So it's an expression of failure when it comes to the mystery of things. People may have personal reasons for wanting to avoid the sciences or tragic scenarios, traumatic scenarios. And I just think we have to keep the lines of communication open and see the limits of these disciplines. They have to be seen together. They're different lenses at different levels, but both of them should not be cataracts blocking a mutual vision, right? To continue the metaphor, it's a unified vision and a deeper vision into the nature of things, if done properly, I think.
Yeah. You're talking about how you can scientifically explain how you look at a sunset and experience a sunset, but it doesn't necessarily give you like the insights into the meaning of why this is joy-filled event, an awakening event, kind of a thing. We do have a lot of scientific explanations like that. They can say, well, the reason that you're experiencing joy is because when you experience these colors evolutionarily, that it does these things in our brains and then releases these chemicals. And so you have this experience. And it's like, it can just flatten it out really fast, but they're also true, so it's like, how do we accept the truth of the sciences without flattening it down? Because they're going to say, well, no, there isn't a meaning there. It's just that these chemicals were released in your brain because evolutionarily you were designed to do that. And so you're just experiencing the shower of chemicals. That is a true statement, but it's not the entirety of it. So how do we reintroduce an enchantment into that flattened understanding in which it's at least giving us a partial truth?
Yeah. Again, partial truth, half truth, right? But it's not a whole truth. This is, again, what Whitehead sort of warns us against. I think one of the most important themes that I continually bring back is just reintegrating ourselves as an expression of nature. So yes, it's true. The explanation is true, but it's no more true than the meaning that we also derive from it. Like, meaning also is true and belongs in this universe. If it weren't the case, we wouldn't have it, but we do. And so it's like both those have to come together. We don't just inhabit a world of barren facts. You can explain things mechanically and say, well, that's just the fact of the matter. But facts and values, this is another insight the poets give us for Whitehead, right, are deeply wedded together. So there won't be an explanation that only looks to the quantitative facts. There also has to be one that accounts for the way in which those facts add up to, or at least contribute to, a qualitative form of experience, a qualitative instantiation of meaning that is realized, that is appreciated by consciousness. Because consciousness, again, is not some afterthought of the universe, right? In my opinion, right? The possibility of consciousness was there before anything was arguably conscious like we are. So part of what the universe is for is the awakening of consciousness. And what consciousness is for, as far as I can see, is appreciation, is understanding, is accessing a whole domain of values that without consciousness would not be awakened. And you brought up color. Color's really interesting. In fact, Max Scheler, the German phenomenologist, draw this great analogy between color and value. He said, when we perceive a color like blue, for example, we're not like projecting the color onto the universe, right? The color in some sense is being announced to our visual perception, right? We don't sort of sit back and have to sorry, okay, what color, analytically are we looking at? It's sort of, there it is. It's amplified into our experience. And he draws the analogy with value, saying in a similar way, we don't purely invent or project values onto the cosmos. Rather, values are announced to our perception. And just as we view colors through visual perception, he says we access values through valueception. So valueception, it's translated from the German, but it's valueceptions are means of perceiving the spectrum or hierarchy of values that is really there in the nature of things. So, again, you can try to flatten everything. There's no necessity to flatten everything. You can flatten it by means of explanation, but the fact is, it's eminently deep. Right? We don't create reality. We come into reality, and there's a whole scaffolding of metaphysical furniture that we discover. We invent some of it, but mathematics, values, whole qualitative domains of possible experience, those are all there. And I just think, again, the point is humility. and not divorcing ourselves from nature. As long as we see ourselves as part and parcel and expressive of nature, the universe should remain enchanted for us, right? Because
Yeah.
as we rationalize, we extend or generalize from our experience to what the rest of the world must be like. And in order for us to exist, the rest of the world is not vacuous and dead. It's not meaningless and valueless, So, those are just a few thoughts, but
Yeah.
it's such an important point, I think.
You talked about values kind of being out there that we then perceive. Would
Yeah.
that then make values objective and not subjective? Or is that an unnecessary, I guess, dualism that was established because if values are subjective,
Yeah.
then they come from within. If they're objective, they come from out there. Is there like a set of objective values that we're all trying to get to, or is it more of a subjective experience of that value set?
Yeah, I think there's a way of seeing the subjective and objective together. Typically, when somebody says values are just subjective, at least in the philosophical literature, it means that it has no real rootedness in reality. It's just your subjective perception of value, but it can be disconnected from the objective world. I think we perceive objective values through our subjectivity, right? I think, and again, subjectivity being a synonym for mind or consciousness in some sense. Mind or consciousness is the context in which we are presented with objective facts of value. So to say a value is objective is to say that it is what it is, independent of what I may think about it. We do this with mathematical truths. An objective mathematical truth, like 2 and 2 equaling 4, is what it is, even if I think 2 and 2 equals 7, right? So again, it's rather a big debate in philosophy. I don't need to sit back and wonder whether a sunset is objectively beautiful. That's announced to me. I don't need to wonder whether rogue violence is terrible. It's announced to me. So it's not as if the universe is sort of a tabula rasa at an axiological level. I think it's replete with potencies and with values and with qualities that come into being and that we awaken to, that we discover in human experience. But of course, couching that in terms of a moral system can become very problematic. And I just want to reiterate Whitehead's statement when he warns against moral codes, right? The dogmatism of moral codes in a universe that is on the move. So this isn't license. Objective morality or objective value is not a license to say that we know precisely, what those values are and can then house them nicely in a static moral system that will apply everywhere. No, morality is on the move too, right? Process applies to all of these domains, but I don't think you can get along in science or religion or various domains without assuming the objectivity of value. And that scares people because if there's real values, where the hell are they, right? How do they work? People are scared of a universe of meaning. It's like, no, it's a good thing, man. It's a part of the enchantment. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're at that 1 hour point, so I got one last question.
Sure.
If enchantment isn't a belief, but more of a practice, what are things that people can do in order to embrace that cosmological humility and kind of, bring dimension back into their flattened world? What are the things, the disciplines, the practices that people can do to bring back that depth perception to reality for enchantment?
Nice. Yeah. There's any number of things, but I just think, to reiterate, sitting with the mystery of the universe as expressed in you is essential, right? I often say you're not an exception, you're an exemplification of the very depths of being and becoming, right? And what this means is that your experience is revelatory, it's a clue. So my advice would be for folks to keep exploring, keep reading, find a practice to adopt and be disciplined about, whether that's meditation or, forest, labyrinth, or modes of prayer. The larger theme being that story belongs in the universe. Your story is not over, right? It's a part of a wider cosmological story that embraces you, and that this is a strange and beautiful cosmos, and you're called to participate in it and provide something significant. I'm confident that you can, but find an element of practice. And spiritual practice, I think, is just really important because it's a disciplined means of rendering transparent the transcendent depths that surround us. And there's insight and there's wisdom there. So don't give up. That's what I would say.
I like it. I like it. Well, I mean, thank you coming on. Third appearance. It's been good. Do you you got anything going on that you want people to tell them about and send them towards? What's happening in your world?
Yeah. Well, first, just thanks. Always fun being in discussion with you. Yeah, lots going on. I've been, writing this Whitehead book, which is 98% finished. I'll be hopefully signing a contract on it soon. Whitehead's Universe, a prismatic introduction. Yeah, all I'd say for now is that for any of the listeners who want to learn more about Whitehead or process philosophy, in 2026, I'm offering on a rolling schedule a 5-week online introduction, which is based upon draft readings of my forthcoming book, and it'd be a chance to learn a lot, to engage with different thinkers, lifelong learners. You don't need to be an expert by any means. It's an introduction to Whitehead's Universe, and I'd be happy to have anybody join. So if that is you out there, go to whiteheadsuniverse.com and you can register and get more information there.
All right. I'll definitely put that in the notes. And when the book is ready and ready for publication, we got to have you back on and talk about it, because it's going to be cool.
Would love to. Yeah, it's been a labor of love. I think you'll enjoy it. So thanks a lot,
look
Tom.
Forward to it. All right. Well, thanks for coming on the show.
Cheers.